we found 280 different pathogens on the microbial species on the gloves. 69% of the gloves had indications of feces. 46% of the gloves had human feces on them. And we found mold and fungus and various other pathogens as well, including E. coli.
My name is Jeff Cross, and this is Straight Talk. Recently, we were shocked to see the news that used, contaminated, bloody gloves were being washed, repackaged, and sold as new and sent to the United States. You had to read the news twice. In fact, it was a real head scratcher as to why that was happening and how those things could happen. Well, to dig into this issue today, we're pleased to welcome Steve Ardaugh. He's the CEO of Eagle Protect, and Steve is also known as the Glove Guy. So Steve, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Jeff, very much.
Good to have you. So let's get into a few questions. 2 decades ago, Steve, you witnessed some conditions similar to what we're seeing now regarding contaminated medical grade disposable gloves. That started you on your journey to create a company to address this global issue. So thank you for that. But let's talk about these contaminated gloves and how they ended up here. How does that even happen? Do people go digging through dumpsters or what?
Well, in the early days, in the early 2000s, I visited a factory in one of the Southeast Asian countries that produces a lot of gloves. And it was actually before we started the company, where I was working as a consultant for another company and looking for suppliers. And it was my first glove factory, and it's a very noisy, for anyone who's been there, it's a very noisy place. It's pretty smelly. There's smells of ammonia and acid and all sorts of things. And I guess in those days, rules were probably slightly more lax than they are now. And I remember going to the packing room where they put the gloves on a huge pile of gloves on a table. And there's people around the table at those days, again, counting gloves. These days, they weigh them, counting gloves out in 25s, and they put 4 lots of 25 in a box. And I remember seeing the packing room. It was just these kitchen-type tables, linoleum tables, no walls, a roof, and one person's job was to walk around the piles of gloves and wipe the cockroaches and the flies off the piles of gloves. And they put them into boxes, which I won't mention the brand, that were destined for the American medical system at that stage. That sort of stayed with me for quite some time, and when I got the opportunity a few years later to start Eagle Protect, we made a point of making sure that all our factories were above that sort of grade for sure. We audited them ourselves. We're a certified B Corp, like Patagonia, for example. So we borrowed their supplier code of conduct and used that to audit our factories. We now use independent auditors to audit for all sorts of things, including labour rights violations. So this sort of thing in a different form has been going on for decades, unfortunately. I often liken the glove business to the rag trade. There's a huge disparity in conditions and quality of gloves and the way they treat people. And these companies are just doing it again and again and again. I have to commend the Customs and Border Patrol to take that sort of step during a pandemic to stick to their guns and actually really send a message. So I hope it's getting across.
So they're finding these gloves in dumpsters. They're just recycling them and washing. How easy is that? Is that a?
Well, I mean, that's the thing. So a lot of people don't understand food. We deal mostly in the food business, sanitation. We don't do too much medical in the US just yet. We do in New Zealand. We're just growing into that. It's obviously a very big market. I mean, pre-pandemic, the US used 228,000 gloves every minute. That's 328 million gloves a day. That's pretty huge numbers. By any account, you could probably double that now, I guess, in terms of usage. Things like the United States government keeps a 90-day supply of essential items in their warehouses. So 90 days times 328 million is too much for me to calculate. But it's a lot of gloves that have been soaked up by the US. It's just the FDA, food compliance in particular, but also medical, doesn't require gloves to be clean necessarily. And there's no checks on arrival generally, unless you're on the watch list as gloves come into the country. And that sort of leads us into our testing system, which we'll probably talk about a bit later on, but where we have spent 5 years testing a number of gloves as we calibrate our own testing system. And we've found just extraordinary occurrences of contamination and pathogen load and things like that on gloves that are destined for the hospital and the food industry and the sanitation industry. The ease of getting gloves into any country, really, not just the US, is quite surprising when they're such a personal item. I mean, every American today has had contact with a disposable glove. If you've eaten food or been in any medical establishment, you've had contact with a glove. So it's, we're trying to raise the profile of how important it is that people know where their gloves come from, what's in them, what's on them, and how they are made and who's making them.
Yeah, there's got to be some level of trust when you buy gloves and they come in a box and you open them, you assume they're new, they're clean, they're ready to be used. Let's move into this question. We've been recently talking about PPE fraud, where companies order personal protective equipment. They send maybe millions of dollars overseas. They get nothing in return. Can you talk about finding reliable sources? I know you have some experience in that.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things with Southeast Asia and I believe anyway is the best way to create a business relationship is to visit them. And obviously that's been difficult, and it's compounded the fact that some of these people have been caught out. I think one of my observations is many, if not all, of the people who have been caught out with these frauds and various other things that have gone on have not been involved in the PPE industry pre-pandemic. They've been seasoned importers in many cases, and they're trying to fill a need, so they're doing the right thing. But they haven't been involved in the PPE industry. And I sort of feel like the wolves were waiting for them because there was all sorts of people doing all sorts of things, and some of your previous guests have explained that better than I can. To source gloves from all over the place, and the quality was terrible if they turned up at all. It's still happening. There's still gloves being dumped into the US that we hear stories of anecdotally. During the pandemic, they produced a glove in large quantities called a Vitrile, which is a vinyl nitrile blend. In most cases that we've seen, they're almost totally vinyl, and people are buying them thinking that they're a quality glove that are useful for medical and food, and in many cases they're not. But the whole fraud thing is just, you've got to get in front of these people, you've got to check the factories out. We only use one factory per brand of our gloves, per type of glove. We don't do like many people do, have made in Thailand, made in Indonesia, made in China on the side of our boxes, because we want to know exactly where our glove's coming from and who's made it, and so we can follow the supply chain all the way back. It's just, you've just got to not send money as well. That's the other sort of startling thing. I guess the demand was so great and the supply so little that people were sending money over sort of sight unseen, and it got lost in the system and still is.
Talk to us, Steve, about the value of being certified to provide valuable PPE. I know your company does that.
Yeah, well, there's a number of things we do. We decided that the food system in particular, but also the medical checks and balances weren't enough, so we created our own system. And we've worked with a microbiologist for the last 5 years on producing a system where we can do a range of tests. There's a 5-layered test process that we now perform on lots of gloves coming into the country. Not our total range yet, because we're expanding that across the range. And we check for things like pathogen loading, physical characteristics, how strong is the glove, has it got holes in it, all these sort of things, the raw materials, what's in that. We use things like mouse embryos, human sperm, gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, all these sort of tools that will allow us to quickly check. And we've devised these tests over the last 5 years. As part of that testing process, it was pretty interesting. We used about 2,800 different samples of gloves, 25 brands of gloves that have been imported into the US over the last few years. And we were trying to calibrate the test to get it all exactly right and easy. We want these tests to be quick and easy and cheap so that we can do them on as many gloves as we possibly can. And we found all sorts of interesting things. We found 280 different pathogens on the microbial species on the gloves. 69% of the gloves had indications of feces on them. So 7 out of 10 gloves that were coming into the US that we tested had feces on them. 46% of the gloves had human feces on them. And we found mold and fungus and various other pathogens as well, including E. coli. And even on one batch of gloves, we found anthrax. So I guess our point is not to scare people. It's just that because gloves come in a box and it looks nice and new, it doesn't mean they're clean. And more sort of importantly, they're not required to be clean to get the FDA food compliance, and in many cases, the medical compliance. They're just required to have certain chemical characteristics. Having said that, the FDA good manufacturing practice says you must use clean gloves. So there's a bit of a disconnect there between what the compliance says and what they say you should do. But that's another story, I guess. So we're trying to raise that profile. We're saying that you should be asking your manufacturer or your supplier, if you're a sanitation business or a food business or a medical business, where have my gloves come from, what's in them, what's on them. And if they haven't tested, they don't know what's in them or what's on them. They're relying on the factory, which in many cases is fine, but as we know, in some cases, may not be fine.